So, slime, clones, and baby factories. Sci-fi for jellyfish sex, and a little bit of feedback. My name is Matt Wilson, and I am a biologist, and as we just mentioned, I am the aquarist at Sitka Sound Science Center. And an aquarist is a subset of a biologist, which means that I am a marine biologist that focuses on animal husbandry. And as a subset of that, I am a gelatinous macroplankton aquaculturist. But what is gelatinous macroplankton? So often when we're thinking about plankton, we have these animals and these organisms that are all being pulled around by the ocean. And plankton literally means drifter. So all plankton are organisms where their movements are largely controlled by ocean currents. They can usually move a little bit, do a little bit of swimming and reorienting themselves, but for the most part, the ocean is in control. And we are often typically thinking about microplankton. Every time we think about plankton, we're thinking about these tiny little things in the water, usually that we need a microscope to see. However, plankton come in all shapes and sizes. This is the ocean sunfish. This is a 1.5-ton animal. This is the world's largest bony fish. But as you might guess from these kind of strange, weird little fins, they're not very good at swimming. They are mostly pushed around by the ocean, and so we actually consider this animal to be plankton. So we're talking about gelatinous macroplankton, though. So these are invertebrates with a jelly-like body, and another name for gelatinous macroplankton is gelata. So you might notice that I called these things gelatinous macroplankton, and at no point did I say that these are jellyfish. And that's because jellyfish are a little bit more specific than that. So a jellyfish is a free-swimming animal in the phylum Cnidaria. And a phylum is a group of animals, and they all have a few distinct characteristics, but it's a pretty broad group. Such as they have a simple gut, so their mouth and anus is the same hole, and all cnidarians have stinging cells called cnidocytes. So this includes a lot of different animals like corals and anemones, and they all have this defining feature, these cnidocytes, these stinging cells. So let's take a look real quick before we get into reproduction, and let's just talk about what even is a jellyfish and what isn't a jellyfish. So this is a whole wall of gelatinous macroplankton here. Let's go through a few of these real quick just to see what we know and what we're going to learn about some of these. So we're going to start with this animal. This is a salp. It is not from a 1960s cookbook. It didn't come out of a Jell-O mold. It is, in fact, an animal, but it's in the phylum Chordata. So it's actually far more closely related to you than it is to a jellyfish, even though it is still gelatinous macroplankton. Fun fact, you are also in the phylum Chordata, so distant relatives. Now we've got another one. This is a comb jelly. This might seem really easy. We've got these nice tentacles coming off the back. Jelly is right in the name, so this is obviously a jellyfish, right? I'm seeing some heads shaking. So this is also not a jellyfish. This is in phylum Ctenophora. So they have sticky cells called colloblasts instead of stinging cells, the cnidocytes that we talked about a moment ago. And they have a complete gut. So their mouth and anus is a separate hole, and they're actually the first animals to ever develop this in the entire animal kingdom. So we've knocked a couple off our wall of gelatinous macroplankton here. Everything remaining here is something in the phylum Cnidaria, but it is not necessarily a jellyfish. So let's zoom in a little bit more. So jellyfish specifically, true jellies, belong to the class Cyphozoa. And so that's zooming in a little bit more from the phylum that we mentioned earlier. They have oral arms, which are these frilly ribbon-like structures hanging down from the center of the animal. And they are not colonial, they are one animal. So let's return to our wall of gelatinous macroplankton and look at a couple more. So, a box jelly. This is another one. Jelly's right in the name. But is it a jellyfish? So, there's no oral arms on that animal. This is in the class Cubozoa. There's no oral arms. And they have true eyes with like actual lenses in them, which jellyfish do not have. One of those things deserving of its own, entire talk, but we're not doing that today. And the man-o-war. This is one that comes up all the time when I'm talking to people about jellyfish. There's a lot of people that have their own man-of-war sting experiences around, and so they get brought up almost synonymously with jellyfish all the time. But is it a jellyfish? No. So you might have guessed by now that this is not a jellyfish. It's in the class Hydrozoa, and it's a colonial organism. This is actually a whole bunch of animals all working together to create a single organism, very similar to how a coral would function. And they do not have oral arms. What you're actually seeing hanging down in the center there is a chain of all of those individual animals all together to create a long stinging tentacle. So we've now knocked out half the things on this wall of gelatinous macroplankton. And everything remaining here is, in fact, a jellyfish. And I'm going to add one more thing here to what a jellyfish is, and that's that they have a metagenic life cycle. So that word, metagenic, is going to be really important, and we're going to come back to that. But first, we are going to quickly look at some jelly anatomy. This is going to be important as we talk about their reproduction so that we know what parts are involved. So I've also highlighted a few things here that are going to be especially important in sexual reproduction. And that might seem strange that we have the stomach and the mouth involved in sexual reproduction, but I assure you that's not as weird as it's going to get. And remember that these animals, they have one hole, so that has to be used for multiple purposes. So we're going to get to the actual jelly life cycle here. This wonderful diagram made by my partner, Bree, in the audience. Thank you so much for being my personal graphic designer. We are going to be starting right here at the Medusa phase. This is the adult jellyfish, probably the part that we are most familiar with. And sexual reproduction occurs between male and female jellies. They have separate sexes, and the males are going to release a bunch of slime. That slime comes out in big strings that contain sperm, and the females are going to pick that up, and they're going to bring it into their stomach. And they've released eggs into their stomach from their gonads, and that's where fertilization happens, is within the female's stomach. Now, imagine that you're a jellyfish, and you want the best for your offspring. What a lot of invertebrates are going to do, like say lots of worms and sea stars and many others, they're going to do broadcast spawning, something I think that was very recently mentioned. And they're going to throw sperm and egg into the water, and they're going to hope through random chance that they're going to meet, that those eggs are going to get fertilized, and that those embryos are going to develop basically on their own. They're going to be totally defenseless out there. But you're a jellyfish. You've got 500 million years of evolution on your side. You can do a little bit better. So what jellyfish do is they brood. Brooding is where those fertilized eggs from the stomach are going to develop into embryos, and then they develop into larvae called planulae. And they're going to crawl down out of the stomach, and they're going to go onto the oral arms of the mother. Now, these oral arms are protected very, very well by the mother jellyfish because she's got all of these stinging tentacles. Those tentacles are not just good for capturing their prey, but they're also good for keeping away predators. So not only do those tentacles have those stinging cells, the oral arms themselves also usually have stinging cells. This has another major purpose here in that instead of dropping off all of your gametes, your sperm and your egg, and hoping that everything's going to develop in one spot all at once, they can go around and they can drop off these little larvae as they're traveling around on these ocean currents. So instead of dropping everything in one spot, they can spread things out. Drop a few here, drop a few there, and that's going to hopefully get better coverage and survival of their offspring. So the planulae themselves, they look like these hairy grapes. This is a scanning electron micrograph of one. They are very small. Some species you can sort of see them with the naked eye, but many of them you're going to need a microscope for. And they are going to drop off the mother jelly, and they're going to look for a hard spot. And this can depend on what species, where they like to pick. So it might depend on what other animals are already colonizing that spot, or even what other species of jellies might already be there. But once they find that nice spot, things get real weird. So this is where we've made it on our jellyfish life cycle. We've gotten to this point right here. That planula has a metamorphosis that it's going to go through, and it's going to become a polyp. So we have completed this section of the life cycle, and that is the sexual portion of the jelly life cycle. However, in order to get all the way back around, we have to complete an asexual portion as well. We can't just do one or the other. So, the polyp is not a baby jellyfish. This is extremely important. They are a separate organism. They have their own mouths. They have their own stinging tentacles. They look very much like tiny little sea anemones. And they are going to do nothing but cloning from here on out. So everything that happens here is all asexual. So the polyps can make more polyps. They can do this in a couple major ways. One is through fission, binary fission, where a single individual is going to literally tear itself in half in order to create two clones. And this is really common among a lot of different animals, including the cnidarians. So we've got an anemone here on the right side, and it is pulling itself apart. It's going to break right there, and you're going to end up with two anemones. The polyps are essentially immortal. They do not age, and they can continue this process as many times as they want. As long as they can continue to eat and gain energy, they can do this over and over and over again. However, they can still be eaten. There are predators of these polyps. Sea slugs are the big ones, nudibranchs. They like to snack on these quite a bit. But this is the key to producing absolutely massive amounts of offspring. There's another method that they can do here, and this one is a little more specialized. So a polyp can basically take a chunk of itself and encapsulate it and stick it next to itself. And what that can do is it can survive bad conditions. So if the water is too warm, if the water is too salty or not salty enough, all of these different things, it can survive all of these bad times. And as soon as the water gets back to where it wants to be, a polyp can erupt out of this. That's what's happening here on, oops, my bad. It can happen right here, erupt from the cyst, and go about its polyp business. And that polyp business is to become strobili. So this is another method of asexual reproduction. This is not the baby jellies yet, but this is where the baby jellies come from. So we've made it to this point in the life cycle, and we're finally getting back to that word metagenic. So metagenic means the creation of something which creates. The polyp is not the baby jellies. The strobila is not the baby jellies, but the strobila creates baby jellies. And it does this through a process called strobilation. So that process starts with the polyp, where it is going to retract its tentacles, and it's going to lose its mouth. Its mouth essentially melts back into its body, and the polyp stretches out, and it starts to stack these little segments on its body. Each of those segments will become a baby jelly, finally. Those baby jellies are called ephyrae. And it looks like a stack of pancakes where the pancake on top is the one that's oldest. And it's going to mature the fastest, and it's going to start to pulse and swim. And when it gets strong enough, it will break away from the strobila and go back up into the water column. And so the strobila is going to release all of these individual ephyra, and when it's done, it can go back to being a polyp. It can do this over and over and over again. It just has to regrow its mouth and be able to eat again in between. So the ephyrae themselves, these are the baby jellies. We've finally gotten to the baby jellies. These are a framework, essentially, for what they will become. They're still missing a lot of what they need in order to actually complete this life cycle later on. And they're usually quite small, but they've got just enough of a head start to get things going. Their job is to eat and to grow. And so they're going to slowly fill in all of those missing parts until finally they make it all the way back around to our sexual medusa, our adult jellyfish. So this has been a little bit of a journey here. And now that you know about jellyfish, it's done, right? That's all we needed to know. Well, biology has this nasty habit of throwing exceptions to all of our rules. So there's a lot of jellies out there that actually don't quite follow this setup. This is the typical method of reproduction, but then we've got things like this. This is Stygiomedusa. This is a 30-foot long deep sea jelly, and as far as we can tell, its entire life cycle happens on its own body. So when we've tried to collect these, or in the rare cases where they've washed up on shore, we've found that a small, fully formed Stygiomedusa sometimes falls out of the big one. So they're essentially giving live birth. We don't fully understand this process, and once again, it's one of those things that's deserving of its own talk. But it's just a reminder that biology is kind of a pain sometimes. But let's actually talk about what I do. I grow jellies. So as an aquarist, I can take this life cycle and I can use that to my advantage in order to get things like my little ephyrae to get back up to baby or get to full adult jelly status. But this takes some equipment and some work. So it takes things like special tanks. This takes special food, and it takes special turkey basters. The turkey basters are not actually that special, but they are a great way to move little baby jellies from one point to another. So jelly tanks, also called chrysals or pseudochrysals, are going to mimic open ocean pelagic conditions. This keeps all your jellies from running into corners and getting stuck or running into too many walls, and it's how we grow them. Whoops, don't let me hit that mic, sorry. But we also have to grow jelly food. So things like lots and lots of sea monkeys and rotifers, these very weird animals with buzzsaws on their face. And then we sometimes also have to grow food to feed to our food, like microalgae. And then sometimes we have to grow jellies to feed to other jellies, because lots of jelly species are medusivores, which means that they eat other jellies. So there's this very simple process here. To grow jellies, you must grow the jelly's food, and the jelly's food's food, and eventually the jellies become the food for the other jellies. Very simple, no problem. So you're sitting there, and you're going, why would you even do this? This guy is a total idiot. I promise that there is an actual reason. And that's that there are a lot of these headlines floating around. If you've been on the internet pretty much ever, you've probably seen a few of these where the jellyfish apocalypse is coming. Jellyfish are going to take over the oceans. There's going to be nothing in the oceans left except for jellyfish. Well, Now that we have learned the jelly life cycle, we know a whole lot more than some clickbait headlines. And we know that if we're seeing lots of jellyfish here, that something is going on here at the polyp to strobila phase. Because remember, these jellies have to come from these strobila. So, strobilation itself is a process that is governed by a bunch of different parameters in the water. Now, these are really great as an aquarist because I can change things like the salinity and the temperature or chemical makeup of the water in order to get jellies when and where I want. It's really convenient. But this also happens in nature on a natural cycle. So let's imagine that a polyp is kind of like a light switch. So the polyp itself is a light switch that's turned off, and when that light switch gets turned on, it becomes a strobila. And so what changes that light switch from off to on is these water conditions hitting just the right point. And throughout the year, what happens usually in late spring or early summer, these water parameters will change and temperatures will rise, and that light switch gets flipped on. Well, it also needs to get flipped off at the end of the year as those temperatures decrease and the polyps go back to being a strobila. So we're going to ask the question, are jellies the problem here? So polyps are reacting to their environment, and we're changing that environment. So what we're seeing with climate change is that as temperatures are getting more erratic and increasing, we're seeing that light switch get flipped on earlier, and we're getting to see it get flipped on and off multiple times per year. And we're also seeing that period that it gets left on increase. And that is what is causing these huge population booms of jellies all over the world. However, we also hypothesize that as temperatures continue to increase, we may get to a point where these temperatures are going to get so high that the light switch gets flipped on and then it gets left on because that temperature never decreases enough to turn the strobila back into a polyp. And so these strobila, remember, they don't have mouths. They can't continue to bring in food and energy. So they'll continue to try and make jellies until they essentially burn out, till they've lost all of their mass. And so we might actually see a huge population crash in jellies as climate change gets more severe. So I haven't necessarily said why we grow jellies yet. I know that was a bit of a tangent, but it gets us back to why we grow jellies. And a big part of that is for research. So this is a project that I was a consultant on. This was a collaboration between the University of Washington and NOAA. And it is really, really helpful when you want to do an experiment that you can control for as many variables as you possibly can. And that's really hard to do if all of the jellies that you want to experiment on, you have to go out to the wild. You may or may not find any, for one, and they're going to be all different ages, they're going to be different sizes, and you're probably going to mutilate them getting them back to the lab. So what we did is we grew jellies for them to do this experiment. So they had a set number of jellies to pull from. They were all the same size, the same age, and they wanted to figure out, do jellies have a favorite food? Which seems like kind of a weird thing to study, except that it was extremely important for these huge population booms that we're seeing, because as we found out, jellies do in fact have a favorite food. They like to eat certain types of plankton more than others. And so if we see these huge population booms of jellies, we know that they might deplete these certain kinds of plankton out of the water. They're going to remove things from that food web, and that could affect all sorts of other animals that might rely on those same kinds of plankton, like copepods. So another reason that we grow jellies is to explore their life cycles. So 100 years ago, scientists didn't necessarily realize that the jellyfish and the polyp were the same animal. Because they'd never observed this life cycle happen, how were they to know that these were related in any way? So it's only as we've gotten good enough to actually grow these animals in the lab that we've been able to say, yes, this jellyfish goes with this polyp and vice versa. Now, as I started getting into jellies a little over a decade ago, there was basically thought to be 2 species of moon jelly throughout the world. there was basically an Atlantic species and a Pacific species, and that has now dramatically altered itself in the past 10 years. So now there's 25 different species of moon jellies documented, and that number is almost definitely low. There's almost definitely more of them. In fact, 11 of them have been discovered just since 2021. Now there's a final reason that I grow jellies. So I grow jellies for you. I want you to be able to see these animals and appreciate them. As an aquarist, especially here in Sitka, I want you to be able to learn as much as you can about the biodiversity of Sitka and this wonderful environment that's all around us. Not just the rockfish, not just the octopus, but the entire life cycle as much as I can. And you'll see where all of these different animals fit into their ecosystem. And I'm hoping that you yourself will see where you fit into this ecosystem. Thank you very much. And before you even have the chance to ask, if you get stung by a jellyfish, do not pee on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that great talk and great advice as well. So now we will do some questions from you. Yeah, like she's running to you.
Awesome. Fantastic presentation. Sure, the memes are great. So I guess maybe two-part question. So by being able to shift between the polyp to the strobile and then back, can the polyp then revert into a cyst to survive like an extinction event potentially?
They can't then revert back into the podocyst where they can survive those conditions, but they can create them. So usually the polyp itself will start to realize, oh man, conditions are starting to get bad. I'm going to start saving away some clones for later.
Cute. And then second part, we've kind of heard over the last talks over these last few days, is there a similar style like wasting disease or any kind of like disease that is recognizable in a jellyfish population that could be responsible for a killing event?
Yes, so what we actually see, and it's a very normal thing that we see every single year, is parasites. So there are these hyperiid amphipods, and they're actually really, really important in making sure that our jellyfish populations basically get killed off at the end of the year. And what happens is you get these medusivore jellies, these big ones like our lion's manes that eat other jellies. They're gonna go start vacuuming up all of the smaller jellies like the moon jellies in the environment. Those moon jellies probably have a couple of those parasites on them, and then they're gonna bioaccumulate them. So they're gonna pick up their parasites, and every single jelly they eat, they pick up more and more of these parasites. And they start to chew on these animals. So these larger jellies are already putting a ton into their reproduction, so a lot of their energy. And so they don't really have time to be repairing parts of their body. And so that's one of the ways that they actually get basically eaten away at the end of the year. So there are definitely parasites and diseases out there for jellies, but there is not any sort of like major like catastrophic event that I'm aware of that has ever affected jellies. Usually in those scenarios, it's some sort of like pollution event, like the Lake Palau, where you might have seen all those golden jellyfish. It got to be a big popular tourist spot, and they ended up actually having a big population crash in Palau because of things like all the pee from all the people going in the water and hurting those jellyfish, essentially.
Yeah, we often see jellyfish way up in estuaries and up tidal rivers,
Right.
but often right before the salmon seem to return. Any idea what they're going up there for?
So you've got a couple different things. You've got areas where they're getting swept into, where currents are naturally pushing them and they're congregating there. So a big group of jellyfish is actually called a smack. So it's basically what a herd is for a jellyfish. And so you get smacks of jellies congregating in these areas. And you'll also see them at points where freshwater is meeting the ocean because you've naturally got a lot of nutrients coming down from those rivers, and that can be causing plankton blooms. And so there's lots of food there for jellies as well. And so that's one of the reasons why you can get a lot of congregation in those areas. So it's a couple different factors all contributing to that.
So I'm just curious, how do you guys get the material to start growing jellyfish? Do you go out and collect jellies on your own, or are you finding these tiny little polyps and trying to collect those? How do you get started?
Perfect, thank you. So because this presentation, I normally go on for like over an hour about this, and so I had to cut a couple things. So for example, that's one of them, where when we want to grow jellies, we do need to collect some adult jellies from the wild. And then we can do a couple different things when we've got them. We can throw them right into a jelly tank, and we can let them naturally spawn on their own. Hopefully we've got males and females at that point, and the polyps will settle on the tank, and I can scrape them off and then put them back into my cultures in the back. Or we can take a whole bunch of jellies, usually like 3 or 4 of them, and we put them in a Ziploc bag. And we basically leave them on the counter overnight. And over that time, they're gonna freak out, and they're gonna go, I don't know what's going on. I think I need to reproduce right now because things have gotten really weird. I'm not getting pushed around in the water. Let's spawn and get it over with. And so they're gonna spawn in that Ziploc bag, and I can go in the next day, pull those jellies out, and I can pipette out of the corners of those bags. I'm gonna get all those larvae that I need. And then the last way that we can do is we can actually do in vitro fertilization, where I take a male jelly and a female jelly, and I directly go in and I pull from their gonads, I pull some eggs, I pull some sperm, and I literally mix it together in a dish. And I can make my own larvae that way. So there's several different ways that we can get the starting material, the brood stock, if you will, for growing jellies.
It's on? Okay. My question is on the smacks when the jellies get together. What is causing that? I've seen that out in the middle, 500 feet deep water. Are they reproducing, or are they getting together to do anything, or how do they get there?
So once again, these are plankton. They're getting pushed around by ocean currents. So they're gonna get all pushed together naturally, but we also may be seeing things like their polyp stage, the strobila stage is all in one spot, and they're letting a whole bunch of those guys go, and they're all growing up in a localized area. We could also be seeing differences in basically the ones that haven't gotten eaten. So you can have areas where they've been cleared out of other spots, and then other areas where they're gonna get all pushed together. They could be following plankton blooms. They can do vertical migrations. They can't really like swim distances, but they can go from deep to shallow following light. And so sometimes you'll see them come up from the deep to follow plankton. But it is always very important for them to be in those smacks if they do want to reproduce. So they've got to be close enough so that when those males release slime into the water that contains that sperm, that a female is there to pick it up. And then you'll also usually see a predatory jelly, like a lion's mane, coming through and eating up some of the smaller ones too, because they're getting pushed into those, and that's gonna naturally feed them the food that they want. So a lot of it is ocean currents kind of pushing everything together, but there are some other factors, including their own movement, that can play into that.
Do jellyfish display sexual dimorphism?
Sorta. So it can be really difficult to tell a male and a female jelly apart because their stomachs and their gonads are typically right on top of each other. So like a moon jelly, it's pretty easy because their bodies are super transparent, but on ones like egg yolk jellies or lion's mane jellies, they're very heavily colored and they're pretty opaque. And so you really can't see the gonads themselves. And so you usually can't tell male or female at that point. But if you've got a fairly transparent jelly and the gonads have ripe gametes in them, you can see that one is more orangey and yellow and another is bright white. And so the more yellow ones are females and the bright white ones are males. But there is another way that we can tell if a jelly is specifically a female jelly because they may be brooding. So a lot of the jellies may have planula, the larvae, that are so large that you can see them on the oral arms, and so they'll compact them all into these brood pouches, and so you'll see these white spots on the oral arms, and so you go, that's a mom right there. So we know at least that much, but it can be really difficult to tell when you're out in the wild. Like when I'm out collecting jellies, I'm just kind of working with random chance. I'm like, I hope this is a boy and this is a girl. I've got 3 moon jellies back at the aquarium right now, and I went, that's a pretty good ratio. I think I've got males and females. They're all boys right now, and I'm really annoyed. So we can then like take some bits out and look at it to see, yeah, I found some eggs in here, I found some sperm, but it can be really tough.
I think you call them strobila, but how long can like the pancake go? Like, how long have you ever seen it?
Right. So it totally depends on several factors. So it can depend on how big the polyp was to begin with, because the bigger the polyp was to begin with, so it's eaten a ton of different plankton in order to get to that size, and it basically has to give up parts of its body to make those baby jellies, those ephyra. And so the bigger the polyp, the more ephyra they can produce. And it depends very much on which species specifically as well as to how many they can let go. So we have some that are called polystrobilators, which means that they're specifically going to have lots and lots of ephyra, usually between like a dozen and 20 at a time. But we also have monostrobilators, where that polyp forms a single ephyra out at the end. It kind of looks like a little flower, and only one ephyra is released at a time through strobilation. And then it also always depends on temperature, because the higher the temperature gets, the faster that all of these processes happen. So it can really, really vary. I have definitely seen a strobila go for a couple weeks, and it also depends on what triggered the strobilation response originally. When I do this in the lab, I like to use a chemical called an indole, and that basically forces them to strobilate regardless of the conditions. It's kind of the cheat way, but it's really, really convenient in that if I keep indoles in the water, they'll actually go till they burn out. And so I actually have to physically change the water back out so that they can revert back to a polyp. So it really has a ton of different factors that can manipulate that process.
Well, so two kind of separate questions. One, do like the fully grown jellyfish have predators other than other jellyfish?
Absolutely.
And then real quick, 2, when you go out hunting for jellyfish to grow and breed, are you looking for specific types, or do all jellyfish reproduce and operate similarly enough that you're just grabbing any jellyfish you can find?
So, a couple different things here. So you said that first one, what other predators are there for jellyfish? We've actually been finding that there are more predators for jellyfish than we ever realized. For example, there are species of salmon that will eat jellyfish. Even cod and other animals like herring will eat small ones. So they are more involved in the whole food web than we originally realized. And there are certain animals like that ocean sunfish that I showed. It actually eats exclusively jellies. And then sea turtles are also another big eater of jellyfish. And then the other part of your question, what was that? Sorry.
That was when you're hunting.
Right, okay, sorry, I remember. So when I'm going out looking for jellies, it depends on what I already have. So right now, I have lion's mane polyps in the back of my lab right now. And because I have those polyps, I don't need to go get more. I can keep those for years and years and years. I once kept the same group of moon jelly polyps for 9 years, and they were the same as on day whatever as they were on day 1. Those might still be being used somewhere. I honestly don't know. But when I'm going out, I'll look for a species I don't have. So right now, I'm specifically looking for some female moon jellies, and I would really love some northern sea nettles right now. Those are the big ones I'm looking for, but it all depends on what I've got.
How many different types do we know of sea jellyfish in Southeast Alaska right now?
In Southeast Alaska, I know of at least 4 different species of true jellies. We have our Pacific moon jellies. We have lion's mane jellies. Those are probably the 2 that are the most common that I've seen, at least so far. We also have northern sea nettles, though those seem to be a little bit further out. And then further inland to the east on the other side of the island, there have been sightings of egg yolk jellies, which I'm more common with down in Washington. But they definitely seem to be around. And then you can get weird events where certain species can also get blown in, just the same way that we occasionally see like a sea turtle up here. You can get things coming down. So there's a brown-rimmed Arctic moon jelly that can occasionally make it down here. From my research, I haven't seen one yet. But you can also get species that get blown up from the south, like Pacific sea nettles as well. But at least 4 that are definite residents.
This summer, you had these beautiful red-eyed medusas.
Yes.
That were just little tiny jellyfish. And I had lived here forever, since '85, and had never seen one. You said you went and scooped them up from the dock.
Yep.
So I just wanted to know a little bit about habitat. Do you find them more in shallow water, or can you find them in deep water? I mean, how would you find one of those if you wanted to see it? It was the most beautiful display I had ever seen, and it went most of summer. I just appreciate all your expertise that made it happen. So,
thank you so much. So red-eye medusa, they are a cousin of jellyfish. They are a hydromedusa. So remember back when I said I'm a gelatinous macroplankton aquaculturist? That's because I do grow things that aren't jellies as well. So red-eye medusa are very seasonal. They're only for about a month or 2 in the wild every single year, and they're in shallow water. And they are usually inhabiting areas near eelgrass beds. So they're going to actually go all the way down to the bottom and then migrate to the surface every single day. And they're trying to find different amphipods and other tasty crustaceans down at the bottom, and then going up into the eelgrass and hoping to catch some things off of the blades of eelgrass themselves sometimes. But they're also one of the really understudied species around, partially because they are so seasonal. One thing I was actually trying to do this summer was to complete their life cycle. It's never been done before. We've never seen their version of the polyp stage before. I got their larva, their planula, but I was never able to get it to settle out and to see what that would turn into. Unfortunately, I also got COVID at the same time, and so I wasn't in my lab for a week, and by the time I got back to my cultures, things had not gone well. But that's how it goes. I'll try again this year, or next year, hopefully, and we'll see what happens.
What are the benefits for jellyfish being in Alaska?
So it depends on which species, because of course we've got hundreds of species of jellyfish that are all adapted to different areas. But up here in Alaska, the further north you go, the more plankton you get. And jellies are typically planktivores. They're eating lots and lots of plankton. So the reason that our water is not crystal clear and blue is because it's so full of life. There is so much plankton in our water, and you also get more oxygen as water gets colder. So that's why we also get some really big jellies. So our lion's mane jellies, they do typically die off at the end of every year, but they can get absolutely massive. The ones that can occasionally survive can get 3 feet, 4 feet, even up to 6 feet across with up to 120-foot tentacles. They can get absolutely enormous. So the benefits of being up here is that you've got a lot of food and that you've got a lot of oxygen in the water, and you can grow really, really fast. And so that's definitely something that is a constant for a lot of the animals up here in the North Pacific.
Awesome. Thank you so much for a great talk and answering all the questions.